Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Royal Society of Medicine. This event, which is live, is part of our In Conversation series. My name is Richard Murley. I'm an appointed trustee of the RSM. Now, we started these interviews back in 2019 when the world was a very different place. So we were obviously able to hold the events in our London headquarters in 1 Wimpole Street. But since the pandemic has started up almost a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, we've been doing everything we can to stay in touch and to stay connected with all of you, with our members and all of our supporters. And those of you who've been with us before will know that we've interviewed a number of key thinkers and leaders in a range of different fields and had, I think, a wide range of fascinating conversations. And my aim is to try to continue that tonight. So it's with great pleasure that I'm delighted to welcome Sir David Clementi. David and I have known each other now for over 40 years. We worked together in corporate finance back in the 80s and 90s on a number of very interesting projects. And David then diversified and went off to be Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. After that, he chaired the Prudential, the major insurance company. He's run a number of other major businesses at chairman level and has done some important work for the government, looking at both the legal profession and at the governance of the BBC. And most recently, and most notably probably, he has just finished being chairman of the BBC, from which he stepped down only 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's a great pleasure, David, to have you with us. You're very, very welcome.
Good. Well, evening, Richard. It's very nice to be here. I'm sorry we're not in Wimpole Street, but anyway, pleasure to see you online.
The other thing I should mention that I should have mentioned, sorry, is that David was also a trustee of the RSM, stepped down 6 or 7 years ago, and I actually took his slot on the board. So David, maybe let's start with the BBC, since I'm sure our audience will be interested in your comments on the corporation. And perhaps start by letting me ask you, what exactly do you do as BBC chairman? How do you spend your time? What does the role involve?
Well, it's a good opening question. I guess the answer in part lies in what is the responsibility of the board of the BBC, which I chaired. And those responsibilities are actually laid out in the Royal Charter. We have a new one in 2017, 11-year charter, and it sets out 5 major responsibilities for the BBC and for its board. The first is the production of impartial and accurate news, and you'll probably return to that later on. The second is an obligation in terms of education, and we meet that in part by our bite-size offering, which has been very important during lockdown. The third is the need to produce high quality and distinctive programming, strong British flavour, promoting British artists, British writers, etc. The fourth is critically important. It's a universality obligation. We have to represent and provide programmes for the whole of the nation, for all the English regions and for the devolved nations. And the fifth is a requirement for the BBC to represent Britain to the world, which we largely do through the World Service, which is broadcast in something like 40 languages. So if you take those 5 responsibilities, the job of the board and the job of the chair who is responsible overall for it is to make sure that the executive are actually fulfilling those obligations. So as chair, you'll set the agenda, and we set the agenda with papers which actually focus in on those 5 public purposes and the budget that we agree on an annual basis. So that, I suppose, is the most overriding responsibility. But there are other things that, as in other organisations, go with being chairman. And the second and really important job is succession planning. We have a board of something like 14, well, exactly 14 people, 4 executives, 10 non-executives. And the chairman chairs the nominations committee and is responsible for ensuring those jobs are properly filled. In some areas, the government has a hand, but the majority of the non-execs are appointed independently by the board. The Director General, who is our CEO, is a board appointment. And in fact, a little over a year ago, Tony Hall, who's our previous Director General, indicated his intention to retire. So the responsibility rested with the chairman and a small group of senior non-execs to advertise the job, to meet with a long list and then with a very short list before deciding that the job should go to Tim Davie. But that was a very significant responsibility. And while I'm at it, let me just tell you, there's one other key job of being chairman, and this is the best job, best part of it anyway, which is the ambassadorial bit, which goes with it. Getting to go down to meet our people on the news floor, going to see our production teams working on whether it's the Chelsea Flower Show or some other commemoration, the last night of the proms, or critically for me, because I'm a big Strictly fan, attending the last night of Strictly, which is a great joy. So that ambassadorial role, which goes with many other chairman roles, is a particular pleasure at the BBC.
Did you find you had to do a lot of public speaking, representing the BBC at conferences on platforms, in Parliament, with ministers?
Yes, there's a certain amount of that. On the whole, the Director General speaks for the corporation, but the chairman, I would make about 3 or 4 keynote speeches a year at conferences or elsewhere, and would go with the Director General to, well, occasionally 3 times a year, to the Select Committee of the House of Commons for a public hearing about how we're doing, and again, largely about how is the BBC doing against the public purposes that are set out in the Charter.
So as you got to know the BBC and settled in, what did you find that was surprising about it?
Well, in some respects, I knew it quite well before I attended, because as you indicated, I wrote a report about how it should be governed and its regulatory procedures. So I knew a lot of the constitutional stuff, but and although, as a listener and a viewer over a lifetime, I thought I knew quite a lot about the BBC. It was surprising to just see the breadth of the offering. We, after all, have 40 local radio stations in the English regions. We have a big operation in Cardiff, big operation in Glasgow, big operation in Belfast, big operation in Salford, big operation in Bristol, where our natural history unit with David Attenborough is placed. So I think that the thing that surprises you about the BBC is the breadth of the offering, and in particular, the size of the offering outside London.
I guess we should probably try and cover some of the themes that I'm sure will be enormously familiar to you, that come up regularly in the media and with commentators. I noticed that when you were leaving the BBC, you very publicly urged, I guess, the government, the powers that be, to avoid, I think it was an act of national health self-harm by damaging the BBC. Can you tell us what exactly you meant by that?
Well, the BBC is regularly held up correctly and held accountable for its doing, but there are a number of people who are professional detractors. There are various parts of the press that see the BBC as competition. There are various right-wing thinkers who think the BBC is a non-market intervention and should be cut back in size. Let's remind ourselves, the BBC's mission, set out in the Charter, is to inform, educate and entertain. And there are many who say, well, it's fine, let's have the BBC inform us. It can do an educational role, but there's no need for it to carry out anything in the entertainment world. It's perfectly well done by everybody else. And we hit back about that. We explain that actually the BBC's entertainment is outstanding. It's true that Netflix provides significant dramas, but it doesn't do much in any of the other genres. There's not much from Netflix in sport, in news, in quiz programs, or in entertainment. So we set the bar high in terms of our drama and in terms of other areas in which we provide entertainment programs. I think, secondly, we are the one organisation which is absolutely about promoting British writers, British actors, British talent. So people like Phoebe Waller-Bridge of Fleabag fame, now making a name and fortune in Hollywood, was spotted up by one of our people, one of our commissioners up in Edinburgh. We make a business to find great talent and recognise that some of them will move on to other areas. And the third thing, just in relative to inform, educate and entertain, is that when the BBC is at its best, you'll see all 3 of those qualities in our program. Who would say that Attenborough's Blue Planet, for example, didn't inform, didn't educate, and at the same time entertain? So back to your point, there are a number of people who would like to cut down the BBC in size, and we fight back against it. And we do it because we are in my view, one of the great national institutions of Britain, alongside, well, you might say the National Health Service, but certainly alongside the armed forces and the monarch. We argue that we are one of the few British institutions which resonates around the world. If you go with a BBC card, route branch around the world, you're treated seriously. The second point I'd like to make, which unionist politicians don't spend enough time on, the BBC is one of the very few British organisations which holds the union together. Health, as we know, is a devolved matter, devolved to the nations. Education is a devolved matter, but broadcasting isn't. So the British Broadcasting Corporation has a responsibility through every single area within the union.
Now we're getting questions coming in from the audience, and everybody please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you want to, and I will try and fit in as many questions I can from others. Obviously, David, a key issue on which you must have spent a great deal of time is funding and the license fee, and it's obviously linked to your point about damage. A number of people are asking. I have a question here from Andrew Hughes, who's asking to license or not to license. Is there an alternative?
Is there an alternative? It's a really good question, and you're quite right, Andrew. I probably spent longer on that question than any of the others. The surveys are quite interesting. If you ask the question, do you support the license fee or would you like to ban the license fee? Lots of people put their hands up. And that is the question that some of our detractors ask, but it's not a fair question really to put it that way. You have to explain the alternatives. When the question is, would you like the BBC to be funded through a license fee or through advertising or through subscription, the license fee comes out significantly ahead of them. Now, there are a number of people who argue the BBC could, in this day and age, surely could move to a subscription service. Why not? We're all used to subscribing. And the answer to that is, actually, I think the BBC could be quite successful as a subscription service. For myself, I would be very willing to pay a great deal more than £157 a year, £3 a week, for what I get from the BBC online, in radio and in television. I would pay considerably more. But it wouldn't be the BBC that you and I know. If you're a subscription service, you have a very different economic model. It's quite a selfish model, which wants to get the subscription income ahead of the costs. A BBC involved and paid for through a subscription wouldn't invest anything like the amount that we currently do in the nations and regions. It certainly wouldn't invest in educational services. It wouldn't invest in British ideas entirely. At least it might, but not particularly. It would go internationally. It wouldn't bring the nation together for shared moments, because sitting behind a paywall, a few people wouldn't, in fact, quite a large number of people wouldn't be able to afford it. And it certainly wouldn't contribute, which the license fee payers do at the moment, £250 million to the world service. That's something we do out of the license fee. And we certainly wouldn't do it if we were a subscription service. So those who advocate a subscription service very rarely face up to actually what it would mean and the many services that a subscription service BBC would have to cut. So we make these points because they're very rarely made by the advocates of subscriptions.
But I guess the license fee arrangement obviously implicitly and maybe explicitly requires the BBC to be relevant and interesting and available to all sections of society in the UK. How do you, or how do your team, or did your team, assess whether they were doing that? Because there's all this commentary out that the BBC is now obsessed with youth and desperately trying to recoup its audience that's gone off to laptops and gaming and so on. How does the BBC approach that and work out whether it's doing the right thing? How do you measure it on the board?
Well, there are any number of statistics which show our market share at particular moments and our engagement. One of the key measures we look at is the extent to which we are used and watched across the nation. The statistics we put out for our last annual report showed that over 90% of the UK population engage with us in a serious fashion at least once a week. And of those who are the 16 to 24-year-old, which is in part the gaming generation, the engagement there is about 80%. So relative to any other service, we are attracting the widest possible audience. But it's something we clearly look at. And we do it not just on our national TV, but we look at our regional television offering. We have 12 regional stations. And as I mentioned, we have 40 radio stations around the UK. They have a real role to play at a time of national crisis. A year ago, we had the floods, and those who are in flooded areas all used local radio to get the information they needed about what was going on. Similarly, in terms of COVID, when the restrictions were based on a regional basis, regional radio was really important. We monitor all these statistics. On the whole, I think the BBC, given how very competitive the broadcasting market has become over the last few years, has done a really good job in engaging with the great majority of the UK population.
I mean, I guess on that theme, it would be interesting just to talk a little bit about how the BBC chooses what to put on the screen. And, you know, obviously the big news this week is Harry and Meghan's interview, which I read the BBC did not bid for. Why would that have been? It might have been on your watch. I don't know. Probably.
No, I think it sort of postdates me. So I don't actually fully know the answer. But here would be my educated guess. If the BBC with a fixed budget had to bid on that, it would have to divert funds from some other source. We'd have to take money away from some other program. By contrast, the ITV's economic model is very different. If they bid for that, they can sell advertising against that particular program. And I believe that they did sell a lot of advertising at pretty much premium rates. And relative to the £1 million they're reported to have paid, may well have turned a profit. We would have, as I say, had to find the funds elsewhere. So the economic model for that sort of one-off something which comes up quickly is very different between the BBC and ITV. And the notion, although I think the programme was of public interest and should have been shown free to air, the notion that we should bid against ITV wouldn't if I had been on the board at the time the decision was made, wouldn't seem sensible.
If you take a couple of other examples, like say EastEnders, which I'm sure somebody else would bid for, maybe not ITV with The Street, but EastEnders or differently rugby internationals, why does the BBC presumably pay up for EastEnders and certainly tender aggressively for rugby internationals?
Well, let's talk about the rugby. Inform, educate and entertain, and a critical part of the entertainment budget is in sport. And it's our job to cover many of the great national events. We put a lot of money aside last year for the Olympic Games, where we're shoveling it forward into 2021. We spent a lot of money on the FA Cup. The Six Nations is very widely watched and is very expensive. The Twickenham Games are very expensive. So we entered into an arrangement, which is known with ITV, that we would bid jointly, and they would get the home Twickenham matches, and we would get in Scotland and in Cardiff. That represents our view that we have a real responsibility to take those sports to different regions of the UK, even though they have a smaller overall audience than say the English games. So I think it was a I wouldn't say marriage convenience, that may be a too strong word, but it was a sensible way for us to do it. We had to bid against subscription service Sky, and we took the view that we would the best chance of winning would be working with ITV.
Now, you and I are both keen followers of sport, and you know, we probably remember in our youth when Grandstand really had, and the BBC had, a very wide range of live events, which is no longer the case. Do you think that's just going to continue to go one way? Can you see the BBC coming back in a big way into sport?
I think that not in the short term. No, sports rights have gone way ahead of inflation, and they've been growing very rapidly. And it's a chance for me just to point out that the BBC actually manages, the license fee has fallen in real terms by 30% relative to where it was 10 years ago. So you'll have to see that part of the cut has come in sports rights and sports programs, Before my time, the decision had been taken to cut Formula One, probably the right decision, but nevertheless, for those who like that motorsport, quite a tough one. The BBC has been cut back in terms of sports, but I still actually more people watch more hours of sport on the BBC than any other programme. That comes as a surprise to those who are Sky subscribers, but they need to remember that that's only those who can afford pretty much premium rates for it. Match of the Day on Saturday night continues to be a hugely watched programme, and the Olympics and the FA Cup also get vast audiences. So the BBC, yes, it's not the dominant player that it might have been in our youth with David Coleman, etc., but it's still pretty important. And it still takes up a very substantial part of our budget. As I say, a large part of our budget this year in sport will be for our, I think it's likely to be brilliant coverage of the Olympic Games.
So to ask the funding question a slightly different way, do you think the licence fee will survive?
I think that every chairman over the last 30 years has thought that during his reign, this would be the last one that where the licence fee actually existed. And remember, back in the 1980s, Mrs. Thatcher set up the Peacock Committee since she believed that the BBC should move to an advertising model. Peacock happily took a different view. I think the issue for the BBC is not so much that it has to be done by the licence fee, but that if you move away from universality of payment, you actually undermine what the BBC is about. There are other ways of paying for the BBC. There are other ways of paying for other public services, as we know, through general taxation. But there are other hypotheticated ways of actually paying for the BBC, which other countries use. In one Scandinavian country, they take a very small part of income tax, which they put towards their public service broadcasting. So there are different ways of funding it, Richard. But if you move away from a universal model of funding, i.e. everybody pays and everybody benefits, you will not have the BBC you have today.
But do you think in a world where politicians are going to continue to put pressure on the licence fee and you may therefore be continuing to face real cuts, how's that going to play out in competition with these behemoths like Netflix and Amazon Prime, coupled with the BBC's range of activities? You sort of feel, don't you, that something's going to have to give?
Well, as I say, we're coping with a budget 30% in real terms less than it was 10 years ago. So, I mean, something has given. We are not able to spend as much money on drama as we would like, and we've already talked about sports rights. There are still a large number of actors and writers who want to work with the BBC, partly through public spirit, partly because we still can command huge audiences. So there are a number of playwrights who want to work with the BBC, a number of trusts who are responsible for sort of books, Agatha Christie Trust, for example, you know, who like working with the BBC and recognise the quality with which we do it, rather than putting things out for open bidding. So I think, look, I don't think life will be easy for the BBC, but I think that it has a significant future. One of the things that I think is worth pointing out for those who wonder about the licence fee and whether they're getting value is when we run trials, and we've run 2 in the last few years, trials where people have had to live for 2 or 3 weeks without any BBC service. And we refund them the £3 a week that they would otherwise have paid. And at the end of it, whatever they thought beginning, at the end of the thing, we cannot cope. We don't know what the weather's going to be. We don't know what's, you know, we missed the 10 o'clock news. I can't manage without Match of the Day. How can I possibly cope without watching Strictly on a Saturday evening? They just find that things that they took for granted are removed from them, and they realise how valuable the BBC is. So I would encourage those of your audiences who think that it's not worth £3 a week to put themselves through the exclusion, and you know, I'll have a whip round and see if I could make it up to them with the money. But I think that most people find this very hard to cope without the BBC. Certainly I couldn't do it. Its online offering, particularly its news offering, is in my view quite exceptional.
So other questions coming in from our audience, from Felicity Mandel. How can we in the medical profession collaborate better with the BBC to inform, educate and entertain? How can we collaborate better with the BBC to inform, educate and entertain? Now, obviously, we are inundated with A&E programs, hospital programs, and so on. How else could the medical profession, which has so much to offer, play a part in, continuing the success of the BBC?
It's a good question. I think that, the part of my problem in answering is I think that the cooperation is already there in large part. Think of the quite outstanding bits that have been on the news at 10, where Hugh Pym or Fergus Walsh has gone into one of your major teaching hospitals and actually seen what's going on the front line. Leave aside what's going on Casualty or Hilby, which are splendid soaps, but think about the amount of time we've spent, and you practitioners have spent with the BBC over the last year, actually telling the public the story of COVID, the story of the vaccination program, etc. I think it's been, in many sense, a really good partnership. I do know Hugh Pym reasonably well. He has felt that he has had a lot of support from practitioners. I don't know Fergus Walsh as well, but I think he has done the two of them, and they both sort of had significant teams, have, in my view, worked really well with your profession over the last year. And I think the BBC has been the main medium for telling the story of the COVID crisis to people around the country.
So perhaps a question about impartiality. Through the Brexit debate, obviously the BBC was trying to walk a delicate path through passionately held views on both sides. But there was quite a lot of pushback, I guess mostly from Remainers, that some of the points being made in the so-called balancing comments from Leavers were basically untrue, and similar accusations came the other way, and the BBC just reported them. How does the BBC approach this issue of impartiality, and how far is it prepared to go in hearing that both sides, in making sure that both sides get a fair hearing?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and certainly from the political cast, the most oft question. Let's just sort of run back and just explain how it works. On the whole, issues of impartiality are delegated to editors. So the editor of Newsnight or the editor of the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news, who are the same person. They will work off our editorial standards handbook. They're almost always very experienced journalists and broadcasters. They have specific training, and they are able to access a team of our editorial policy group led by a very senior director called David Jordan. And the most serious issues are pushed up to the Director General. So there is a significant number of checks and balances within the manner in which we set up our main programs. Of course, we're attacked by people. My mailbag was always full of people complaining on one side or another. But for a large time, part of my time as chairman, I kept 2 letters on my desk. Both were from members of the House of Lords. And one of them said, you are hopelessly against Brexit. And the other said, you're hopelessly against Remain. Their particular case was that we were not taking seriously what they said was the overwhelming case for a second referendum. They said it's self-evident we need to have one, and you, the BBC, are not putting the case for a second referendum anywhere near clearly enough. I've kept those 2 letters because the essence of both letters was the same. We hear our opponent's view too often, and we do not hear our own views often enough. And one of the difficulties of the BBC on the issue of impartiality is the fact that we all sort of live in echo chambers. It's just inevitable. We buy the newspaper, we buy a newspaper. We buy a newspaper which often reflects our own views. We mix and meet with friends and family who share many of our own values, similar backgrounds, similar values. We are constantly surrounded by people who actually probably think largely as we do. And that makes life very difficult. What I've learned at the BBC is that however strongly I may feel about a particular issue, there is a significant number of the population, intelligent, well educated on these issues, who have a very different view. And the BBC has to reflect those. You asked a specific question about outright lies, and that's an issue if somebody actually perpetrates that on a linear, i.e. live broadcast. But one of the good things about the BBC is a service we provide called Fact Check,
Yes.
and it takes apart speeches that some politicians make and runs through them and saying actually what the facts are. And I would encourage those listening in occasionally to use that service. There was one recently, very interesting, of a speech that Trump had given shortly before he stepped down from the presidency, listing the sort of 10 major paragraphs and setting notes on each one as to why they were quite false. So I would encourage you to do that. It's something that we would like to do, we could possibly do more of, but actually getting the balance of impartiality right is one of the biggest issues that we face. I think that on the whole, our reporters, one thinks of Hugh and Fergus or Laura Kuzma, I think do an outstanding job. When I think of the thousands of hours of news we produce up and down the land over the course of a week, we make very few mistakes. The mistakes are hugely exaggerated by our opponents. And on the few occasions we make them, I hope we own up quickly. But in general, I think the BBC have done a very good job. Compare that with the partisan nature of American media, and you realize, and I realize I'm biased, you realize how very fortunate we are to have the BBC.
So perhaps I can ask the pay question, on which you must have spent a certain amount of time, and two aspects of the pay question. First aspect is, how do you determine how far to go? Because there are some people at the BBC who to this day are paid, Gary Lineker famously paid very large sums of money, but there are presumably others where you walked away because you weren't prepared to match what others were prepared to offer. So that's question one. And then question two, which is related but different, is obviously the male, female, the discrimination allegations that have been flying around, and how you looked at those and how you think the BBC is getting on with dealing with those.
On the pay issue, the issue of how much to pay writers, presenters is largely delegated below the board. So I wouldn't have had much direct involvement in that, although I do note that any number of stars during my time walked away. Chris Evans was the highest paid person in the BBC when I arrived and walked away to earn more money elsewhere. And I've never seen any suggestion that any of our highly paid people couldn't actually earn more if they went to work for one of our competitors. The area that I spent a lot of time on was the payment of managers and our senior executive team. And that starts at the top. The Director General of the BBC, who probably has the toughest job in broadcasting in this country, is paid £500,000 a year, more or less. And that may sound a very significant amount of money, but it's a fraction of what his opposite number at Sky earns. It's about a quarter of what his opposite number at ITV earns. It's actually, rather surprisingly, very significantly less than the chief executive of Channel 4, which is another public service broadcasting. So starting at the top, the Director General takes, relative to the market, a very significant discount. And that is true of most of our senior managers. They could go into the private sector and earn considerably more. So in the area that came directly under the control of me and the remuneration committee, there's no evidence to me that we ever paid our people. All the evidence I saw is that they're taking a significant discount. On your issue about male-female, we are rightly held to account. Actually, we have one of the lowest gender pay gaps of all the broadcasters. Now, you may say, well, why do we cop all the publicity? And the answer is that we are accountable, and we need to make sure that there are no exceptions, the general rule of equal pay. There were some exceptions. There were some exceptions around people who had been in the same job for some time and should have been paid the same. They'd actually just been all moved up by inflation for a period of time, and no one had fully addressed the issues. These weren't, in my view, gender issues. They were issues of management failure to actually grade people properly. So I think, the BBC took considerable ill publicity, but on the whole, I think our record is pretty good. the reviews done by auditors and by the Equalities Commission gave the BBC a clean bill of health, and I was very pleased about that.
So perhaps a last question on the BBC before we move on. Obviously, the whole issue of levelling up is front and centre in the government's agenda, and we read about the Treasury moving to Darlington.
Yeah.
And I remember in our day they were moving to Bootle. We used to talk about that. Now, the BBC was, I imagine, forced in the real world to lead on this question with the move to Salford. Does the BBC think that was a success, and do you think it's had a good effect in that part of the nation's economy?
I'm not sure your word "forced" is correct. Actually, I think that the BBC recognised its responsibility to move what it could outside London, and it moved. All the sports programming comes from Salford. So do all our education services. It was largely started by Mark Thompson when he was Director General, but all the Director Generals since then, Tony Hall and now Tim Davie, have wanted to continue that. Tim has indeed committed himself to getting 2/3 of our people. Currently, it's over half outside London, getting 2/3 there. We now have 4,000 people in Salford. I think that there is no question, if you speak to the local politicians there, of the beneficial effect on the local economy, because so many other organisations have been attracted there. We went to Salford, but a number of people have followed. ITV has big studios there. I think the number of people employed in Media City, I'm not certain, but maybe as much as 10,000 people, largely because the BBC moved there. It's a magnet for other people to want to follow. So I think we did a good job there, and our wish to move further things outside London isn't because anybody's forcing us to do it. It's because we think it's good business.
And do you think that has helped this is another right-wing criticism of the BBC, the metropolitan liberal bias, which I think goes beyond politics and goes to social attitudes and everything else. How did you look at that, and how does the BBC look at that? Because it really does range across a whole series of issues, cultural issues, political issues, social issues. How did the BBC approach that?
Well, this is because most of your friends are bankers, Richard. This is
well, they're not necessarily metropolitan liberals if they're bankers.
Well, look, I think that be careful of the echo chambers in which we all spend our time. The surveys that I see actually show quite an interesting generational split on perceptions of the BBC. Those who are over 50 believe that the BBC is full of soft left thinkers, leans to the left, and that's evident in all it does. The younger generation below 30 think that we are part of the establishment and lean to the right. A year ago, I gave a speech. You asked about giving a speech. I was giving a speech in Salford, as it happened, School of Journalism there. And after I'd given the speech, some of the young students came up to me and wanted to present me with a dossier which they had prepared of the bias that they saw that the BBC had demonstrated in the election of December 2019 towards the Conservatives. They were absolutely convinced that the BBC had not been even-handed and had fallen over backwards to help Boris and his team. I encouraged them to send it straight to Downing Street, but because I didn't recognise that. I think in our election coverage, there are, of course, a lot of rules about how elections have to be done equal time for major political parties, but we were scrupulously fair. But it's interesting the different perceptions that you see around the country. If I listened only to my close friends, I might believe that there was some liberal bias, but I recognise that actually a whole raft of people have a very different view. The other thing you need to remember, just while we're on it, Richard, is that actually the people we're talking about are journalists. And the thing you observe about journalists is that the thing that really interests them isn't so much whether they lean to the left or the right. They're journalists. They're interested in a scoop. They want to get some news before anybody else. And critically, they want to hold politicians and those in power to account. And when they do that, with Andrew Marr on his Sunday show. When our journalists hold politicians to account, the natural thought is that the BBC leans against the government of the time. That isn't correct. It's merely that these are people who are in power. They've been elected on a certain manifesto, and it's part of our job and a number of other people's job that they should be held to account.
Well, in preparing for this, I was looking at the Wikipedia entry for BBC Prejudice, which is really quite interesting because it very much backs up what you say, because there are entries in all sorts of different directions. So maybe in the last several minutes, should we change gear and move on to some of the other parts of your career and one or two points on that? And maybe given where we are, let's start with the RSM.
Yeah.
You were a trustee of the RSM for a number of years. You passed the chalice to me. I'm very interested in, as you look back on it, your reflections on the RSM as an organisation, the way it supports the medical profession, its role in medical NHS society. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I have to say I really enjoyed my time on the board of the RSM. I didn't think it was a chalice of, if it was a sweet one. The president, when I was on, was first Robin Williamson, a surgeon. Then I think he passed the baton to Parveen Kumar, who I believe writes one of the key textbooks for the medical profession. And then in turn, she passed on to Sir Michael Rawlins, who I think, from memory, was a pharmacologist. These are people of distinction, and there were a number of people on the board, very high quality people that I really enjoyed spending time with. So the time I spent on the board, certainly at the board meetings themselves, were generally good value and worthwhile. Of course, the RSM then, and probably still today, has a challenge. As a doctor or a healthcare professional, you don't actually have to belong to the RSM. But I felt it provided good value for all. It was a meeting point for healthcare professionals from different disciplines, covering both mental and physical well-being. The leading providers we know of postgraduate of courses of various sorts, particularly for specialist subjects. And it had a world-class library, which when I was on the board, we were spending a lot of money digitizing. I hope that's yielded results in COVID, since that's about the only way to access it now. But overall, I thought we were doing good work in these areas, added to which the club facilities in Wimpole Street were very nice. To those who lived in London, it was a very good place to meet. And to those who lived outside London, a good place also to meet, but to stay as well. So in general, I considered that the RSM provided good value. My job on the board, probably the one that you've picked up, was to make sure there was good financial common sense. I was a member of the audit committee, and I was particularly involved in the financial planning and ensuring that the RSM lived within its means. I'm sure you've continued that tradition.
Well, it has its ups and downs, shall we say, as I think members will know. But just to broaden the discussion out a bit, you trained, I think, as a chartered accountant, didn't you? So you obviously got to know medics a bit through the RSM, and you must have learned a lot about doctors from just general interaction with friends and colleagues. And then in more detail, you look very closely at the legal profession. And now each of these professions has had its brushes with the government. The accountants are having a particularly tough time at the moment over audit. But generally, the UK's professions, I think, are held in high esteem, their regulation, their status around the world. But doctors, I think, still feel that they find it hard to have their say effectively heard in the NHS, and with the government more particularly. What do you think doctors should do about it, from what you've seen and experienced in other professions?
Well, look, as you, I think, Richard, you chaired one of the major teaching hospitals, so in some respects, your views will be of greater value than mine. I have a very high regard for the healthcare professionals, partly from my time, as you say, at the RSM, but in particular my own experience of doctors and healthcare professionals, and living where I do, having been well served by my local GP practice for the last 44 years. You know, the NHS has worked incredibly well for me and my family. I have to say, and having a choice between having a good doctor by my side or having a good lawyer by my side, I'd certainly always choose the doctor first. Certainly a good surgeon, since I'm asleep when he's doing his job, I try to stay awake when talking to lawyers. It's a good rule if you possibly can. I would say that generally the reputation of the healthcare professionals is very high. And of course, in this COVID crisis, has risen to a new level. I can't imagine, Richard, that you and I will ever step outside our houses to clap either bankers or lawyers. Not likely in my lifetime, I have to say.
Exactly not.
I think that if I have one observation, I have a number of observations about the medical profession. But one of the things that surprised me, if you look at the banking profession, banks are run by bankers. If you look at the legal profession, legal practices are run by lawyers. But if you look at large parts of the NHS, they aren't actually run by doctors or other healthcare professionals, although there are exceptions. They're run by administrators. And that is certain to cause an amount of difficulty and tension. On the whole, organizations need to have at the top those who've actually been in the front line, partly because they can better understand what the issues are, and partly having reached decisions, they are better able to communicate the difficult trade-offs and decisions that those at the top of organizations have to make. They carry more credibility because they've been there. They have been in the line of fire. And therefore, I think one of the issues, if I was looking into the medical profession, I would be asking is, how easy is it, and what are the incentives to move from being a first-rate clinician, for example, to being more involved in administration? So the questions I would be asking is, how easy is it to combine a role as a clinician with being a senior administrator? I imagine it's very difficult. I know one or two people do it, but I imagine that's very difficult. Are there ways it could be made easier? Secondly, I'd ask myself, what are the economic incentives to move from being a top-level clinician to actually being more involved in administration? Now, I can well see that those, particularly surgeons with strong private practices, would find the economic incentives very difficult. But what within the NHS are the economic incentives for clinicians to move and get more involved in the administrative side of the business? And thirdly, and particularly for the RSM question, what are the courses that the RSM or the BMA are running to help doctors understand some of the difficult issues around organizations and budgeting? After all, if you go out in the world, meet engineers, there are any number of courses which help engineers transition from being specialist engineers to being more involved in general management issues. What are the courses available for doctors to explain to them some of the issues involved and the accounting practices involved in running significant organizations? I don't know the answers to these questions, and you would know them better than I would, but I just merely observe that this is the one profession which tends to be run by people other than those who train at the grassroots.
I think you're right. When I was recruiting for a CEO at UCLH, we looked all over the world, and all of the candidates from overseas were doctors, and none of the candidates from the UK were doctors. And I was actually very proud to appoint a very successful Dutch academic manager, clinical manager, who was still practicing actively and at UCH continues to practice actively. So I very much recognize what you say. Just looking at some other things that you have done over the years, it does seem to me you have something of an affinity for establishments, institutions, because you have been, is it Warden of Winchester? I must get my terminology right. You have been head of the Mercers, you've been at the Bank of England, the BBC. What is it that attracts you about this type of institution? You're not coming over as a natural rebel, David.
Yes, you've painted me as very much an establishment figure, and I suppose my educational background would put me in that category. But I don't think anybody goes out or starts life with that sort of intention. I must get to this job or that job. I think one of the rules of life is do the current job well, and others will be offered to you. All sorts of things that I didn't expect have come my way. Yes, going back to chair the Board of Governors of our school was a pleasure. I was invited, which I really enjoyed. I spent 8 years and became chairman of the audit committee for the Royal Opera House. I never expected that. I really enjoyed it. So one of the rules of life is, as I say, do your current job well, and you may be offered other things which may or may, you may want to do. I don't think I set out to do those things. I have actually chaired one organization, which was a startup in the financial tech area. Never quoted and probably not on my CV, but I did spend 12 years chairing it, and it was a hugely enjoyable experience. So I wouldn't say all my experience have been with establishment organizations, but the great majority, you're right, have been.
Now, there's something of a lobby from the audience to get your view on the America's Cup, because I can see from behind you
Really,
very
yes.
well that you're a keen sailor. Where did Ben Ainslie go wrong? Where did Ben Ainslie go wrong?
Well, we're moving off piste here significantly. I am a keen sailor, but an amateur sailor. I think it'd be wrong to say that Ben Ainslie went wrong. I think actually he put up a very good show down in New Zealand. Consider the nature of the America's Cup. It's very heavily biased in favor of the defender, because the defender sets the rules. And it sets the rules largely in conjunction with a challenger record. The challenger record in this case was the Italians. And the two of them, as I say, the Kiwis and the Italians, actually spent several months designing the new type of fast foiling boats, as some of you may have seen on the television. They're fast foiling monohulls. They're doing about 50 miles per hour, and they are extremely quick and very high tech. The nature of the foils underneath the water, which get the body of the boat, the hull of the boat, to lift out of the water, is very technically complex. And therefore, almost all the advantage went to those who were setting the rules. Ben was handed down the sort of envelope of rules about 9 months after the Kiwis and the Italians had actually formulated them. So I think he did extremely well. In the end, he was beaten by the Italians. The America's Cup started this morning. I had to be up at 6:30, so I hope I'm still on my game now, but I was up at 6:30 watching it. We've had 2 races so far, it's 1-1. It may get down to the wire. It's going to be a very tight
I was going to ask,
regatta.
Who are you backing to win?
In general, the Brits want the Kiwis to win. We had a good relationship with the New Zealand team. We are made very much at home there. Ben gets on with them well. Ben Ainslie, who skippers our boat. So yeah, look, I hope the Kiwis win, but actually I also hope it's going to be a really tight series, and we'll get a large audience and following. And
for you, you've done a lot of sailing in your life. What is it that appeals to you about sailing?
I sort of got to sailing for a medical reason. I was, when I was at university, I was a very keen runner, a keen athlete, and training every day and representing the university. So I was did a lot of running, but actually in so doing managed to damage my hips. And so that by the time I was 22, it was already clear to me that in my late 40s, I'd have to have 2 new hips, which I did indeed get when I was about 50. So I had to have a sport which didn't require too much running, in fact, no running. Actually, I'd started sailing when I was 18, but it was a perfect sport to turn to as I moved from one side to the other. Not that, however, when I was actually running my own boat, that I was allowed by my son and the rest of the crew to do very much. I only had 2 jobs on board the boat. The first was navigator, which I really enjoyed. And the second, less pleasant, was I was the check writer.
Yes, I'm going to say paying, presumably featured largely as well.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. This has been great. Can I ask one last question? You've done an extraordinary range of very interesting and quite varied things. As you look back on it, which one have you enjoyed the most? Which has given you the most satisfaction of all the roles you've held? Why?
I think in the end, although it's the most recent and one shouldn't let that outweigh other factors, I think in the end, being involved in the BBC for 2 reasons. One, because, as I've tried to indicate, I think it is an organisation of colossal importance to the UK, and it was a real privilege to be able to be the chair of it. And the second reason I loved it is because the people who are there are extremely nice people, professional people, prepared to sacrifice some money to work in public service broadcasting, and very able to be. I really enjoyed the people who were there. So I'd actually put the BBC ahead of all the other activities I did, many of which I really enjoyed and don't regret it. But I think having the privilege at the end of my career of chairing the BBC was very significant for me.
Okay, well, thank you. I feel we should be playing records for Desert Island Discs, but thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, you didn't ask me what my 8 records would be or what I'd do on the desert island. I'd certainly want to have a boat there so I could sail around the place. Look, it's very nice to see you, Richard. As you say, you and I have known each other for over 40 years. And you and I were in the heat of battle with one or two mighty transactions of privatization back in the 1980s. So we were bonded for life.
One of the things that I should disclose is that David may not remember this, but he read the lesson at my wedding. And I remember you had FA Cup final tickets, which you gave up to read the lesson at my wedding. So I still remember that and I'm suitably grateful. So David, thank you very much. It really has been a very great pleasure and very enjoyable. Just addressing a final word from me to our audience. Thank you very much for participating, everybody. Now, as you know, you haven't been charged for the webinar this evening, but if you wish, we would very much like you to support the RSM in these very difficult times so that we can continue to support others. We are a charity and our purpose is to advance health through education and innovation. And it's really through educating our doctors and healthcare professionals and helping them to innovate that we can prepare them for the next health crisis and other important tasks. So if you would like to make a donation to support us, do please go to support us on our website or follow the link that's on your screen. Thank you again for your generosity and thank you very much for being part of the RSM's In Conversation series. Have a very good evening. Thank you. Good night.